Everyone laughed at the woman when she inherited a dilapidated house on a swamp. No one believed that anything good could come out of this ruin, but what she found inside silenced even the loudest mockers. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories. Where are you watching this video from? Write in the comments. Anna Lawson had never thought much about inheritances. They belonged to other people's stories, the kinds of tales whispered at family gatherings where distant cousins suddenly found themselves with a fortune or at least a slice of land to squabble over. Her own life had never brushed against that sort of mystery. She had learned early that her family, fractured and thin as it was, had very little to leave her beyond a scattering of old photographs and half-remembered stories. And yet one gray afternoon, in the middle of her own unraveling life, the phone call came from a notary in New Orleans. The man's voice had been measured and impersonal, like he had made the same call countless times. Her uncle, a solitary figure she had last seen when she was a teenager, had passed away. He left behind a property deed. A house, the notary said. A house on the water, deep in the Louisiana swamps. Her name was on the papers, signed in careful strokes by a man who had clearly anticipated this day. At first Anna laughed, though there was nothing humorous about the sound. She was standing in the kitchen of her small rented apartment, peeling the remnants of a coupon sticker from a can of soup she had been about to heat for dinner. The idea of her receiving anything of value was absurd. She was 35 years old, divorced, with debts that gnawed at her from every direction. Her ex-husband had taken the car and most of their savings, leaving her with a battered sedan that barely ran and a collection of bills that stacked like a wall around her narrow life. She worked odd jobs, secretarial one month, waitressing the next, always scrambling to meet rent. A house, even one in ruins, sounded like fantasy. When she told a few acquaintances about the news, their responses had not been kind. One shook his head and smirked. That place? It's half underwater. Been that way for years. Not worth the gas to drive down and look at it. Another woman who had grown up in the same parish as her uncle chuckled, saying, "You don't want that old wreck. Whole thing is sinking. Better to sell the deed cheap to someone who will salvage the lumber before it collapses." Even the landlord who overheard her on the phone told her bluntly to be careful. Houses like that eat money. You got none to spare. She considered ignoring the notary, letting the house rot until someone else claimed it. But something about the tone of the man's voice lingered with her. He had described the property as though it carried more than material weight, as though the signature of her uncle, scrawled in ink, had been deliberate and thoughtful. Against all logic, she began to feel the tug of it, like a rope pulling at her chest. The days that followed were restless. She found herself staring at the address on the paperwork, imagining the swamp she only half remembered from a visit long ago. She remembered her uncle as a quiet man with watchful eyes, someone who preferred listening to the sound of water and birds to conversations. He had always seemed out of step with the world. Perhaps that was why he had vanished into the swamp decades ago. The memory stirred something deep inside her, a curiosity wrapped in unease. Finally, one morning, when the weight of bills and the stale smell of her apartment pressed too heavily against her, Anna packed a bag, locked the door, and started the old sedan. The drive south pulled her away from the predictable landscape of strip malls and traffic lights into something older and stranger. Asphalt highways gave way to narrower country roads, then gravel, until finally she was following a winding path that looked as though it had been carved from the wilderness itself. The deeper she went, the more the land changed. The air grew thick and damp, filled with the earthy perfume of mud and stagnant water. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like drapes of silver, and the hum of insects became a constant, vibrating chorus. The further she drove, the more she felt that she was moving backward through time, leaving behind the noise of the city for a place that breathed in a slower, more primal rhythm. Her car jolted as the road narrowed into a rutted track. On either side, water spread between the trees, glimmering dark and still beneath the low sun. Great herons lifted into the air at her approach, their wings casting shadows like long blades across the path. Every mile pressed her deeper into isolation, but rather than turn back, she felt herself drawn onward by the strange magnetism of the land. When she reached the edge of the property, her breath caught. The house, Her house now stood before her on weathered stilts that sank into the brown water. Its roof sagged under the weight of years, tin sheets curling and rusting. The porch tilted, boards missing like teeth knocked from a smile. Windows stared out as black hollows framed by walls that bore the green stains of endless damp. It looked less like a home and more like the skeleton of something long dead, yet stubbornly refusing to fall. Anna killed the engine and sat gripping the steering wheel, listening to the ticking sound of the cooling car and the drone of insects outside. She should have felt despair at the sight. Instead, she felt a strange quickening, a thrum in her chest as though some forgotten part of her recognized the place. It was ruined, yes, but it had endured, clinging to the swamp like a survivor. She stepped out, her boots sinking into the soft mud at the edge of the track. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of water plants and decaying leaves. She stood for a long time just looking at the house. For years her life had been one long erosion, everything slipping away from her, piece by piece. And here was this wreck, still standing, waiting for her. The first step onto the porch groaned under her weight. She half expected the wood to crumble, but it held. The boards were warped and slick with moss, the railing missing in places. But there was a solidity beneath the decay. She placed a hand against one of the pillars and felt the roughness of old wood that had weathered storms and floods. As she stood there, she felt the absurdity of her situation. She owned nothing in the world but debts in this ruin in the swamp. Yet for the first time in months she felt something like anticipation rather than dread. The house might have been broken and half forgotten, but so was she. Perhaps together they might still stand. Behind her the swamp whispered, a chorus of frogs beginning their evening song as the sun slipped lower, turning the water to molten gold. Ahead of her, the door sagged on its hinges, swollen with years of damp, but it was still there, still waiting to be opened. She drew a slow breath, tasting the weight of the air, and stepped forward into the threshold of her inheritance. The swollen door gave way with a reluctant groan, and Anna stepped into the dim interior, her eyes adjusting slowly to the gloom. The first impression was of air heavy with damp, a stale mixture of mildew, rot, and the faint sweetness of dried herbs that clung stubbornly to the walls as if the house had inhaled a lifetime of smells and never let them go. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light that slipped through cracks in the boarded windows, and the floor creaked beneath her weight in long, aching protest. She stood still, taking it all in, realizing that she had just crossed a threshold that was more than physical. The outside world had fallen away, and in its place stretched the stagnant quiet of a house held fast by time. The front room bore the skeletal remains of what must once have been a living space. A rocking chair with one arm missing leaned against the fireplace, its fabric seat stained dark with age. A heavy oak table sat crooked on warped legs, one drawer half open as though someone had left in haste decades before and never returned. Against the walls, shelves drooped beneath the burden of books swollen with moisture, their spines bowed and unreadable. She ran her fingers across the closest shelf, and the covers disintegrated into flakes at her touch. It felt as if she were disturbing something sacred, something that had waited too long to be seen. She ventured further, each room a chapter of decay. In what must once have been a bedroom, a narrow bed frame rested on its side, springs jutting like broken ribs through a sagging mattress. Faded curtains clung limply to rusted rods, their fabric stiff with mildew. An old wardrobe stood half open. Inside, a few dresses hung like ghosts, their patterns faded but still visible under the dust. The sight of them filled her with an inexplicable sadness. They were remnants of a life once lived here, of laughter and arguments, of meals cooked and stories told in the quiet of evening. The house was not empty. It was saturated with absence, every object a reminder of what was gone. And yet, amid the ruin, she found traces of care. In the corner of the kitchen, a row of glass jars lined the shelf, their lids carefully sealed, inside herbs and roots perfectly preserved as if awaiting use. The labels, written in her uncle's precise hand, had blurred with time but were still legible. Chamomile, marsh violet, cypress bark. She touched them lightly, astonished that after years of neglect they remained intact. Beside them, a bundle of dried plants hung from a hook, their brittle stems bound with twine. The faint perfume of lavender lingered in the air around them, a fragrance out of place in such a decay. It felt deliberate, as though he had wanted something to survive, to endure the rot and the water that gnawed at everything else. The deeper she went, the more she realized that her uncle had not abandoned this place without thought. In a study near the back of the house, she found boxes stacked neatly against the wall. Inside were notebooks, their pages filled with sketches of plants, notes written in careful script, symbols that looked like coded references. She leafed through them cautiously, each page revealing diagrams of roots, leaves, and blossoms. Some had annotations about properties tested or soil samples collected, language that seemed almost scientific. She was no expert, but she recognized an obsession in those pages, a lifetime spent recording the swamp as if it were a vast puzzle only he could solve. It was in that same room that she noticed the floorboards. At first, it was nothing more than a sense of difference beneath her feet, a slight hollow sound when she shifted her weight. She crouched down and examined them more closely. The planks were newer than the rest of the house, smoother, less warped by time, and cut in the shapes that didn't quite match the haphazard construction around them. It looked like a repair, but too deliberate, too precise. The boards seemed to cover something. She pressed down and felt the wood give ever so slightly under her palm. She searched for a tool and found an old iron poker leaning against the hearth. Using it as a lever, she pried gently, and one of the boards lifted with a sharp crack of nails tearing free. Beneath was darkness, an opening into a hidden compartment no larger than a trunk. The smell that rose from it was different, not the damp rot of the rest of the house, but something cleaner, preserved. Her pulse quickened as she bent lower, straining to see. Wrapped in waxed canvas lay several small crates, the material still repelling water after all these years. She pulled one free, surprised by its weight, and set it on the floor. With trembling fingers, she unwound the layers of canvas and twine. Inside were glass jars and metal tins, each carefully sealed. Some contained dried roots, others fragments of leaves suspended in liquid. To her astonishment, many still looked vivid, their colors preserved as though no time had passed. She found a small wooden box nestled among them, and when she opened it, she gasped. Inside, nestled in cotton, were vials filled with what appeared to be extracts, each labeled in her uncle's script with numbers and symbols she could not decipher. He had hidden his work beneath the house, preserved against the inevitable decay. Her discovery left her breathless, but the house had more secrets yet. That night, as darkness fell and she tried to settle on the least unstable section of the floor with a sleeping bag she had brought from her car, the swamp pressed close around her. The sounds outside seemed amplified by the thin walls. The croak of frogs, the distant bellow of an alligator, the constant hum of insects. The air was thick, nearly suffocating, and every creak of the old timbers made her wonder if the house would finally give way and plunge into the water. She drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, and in her dreams the house was alive, breathing with her, whispering in the voice of her uncle, urging her to look deeper. She awoke before dawn, the first pale light turning the water outside into a mirror. Rising stiffly, she returned to the study and knelt beside the opening in the floor. Something compelled her to look again, to reach further. She lowered her hand into the cavity, her fingers brushing against the rough canvas of another crate. This one was larger, wedged tightly into the space. With effort, she dragged it out and unwrapped it. Inside, she found not jars or roots, but instruments. There was a brass magnifier, a set of calipers, a microscope carefully folded into its wooden case, and a small scale for measuring precise weights. They were scientific tools, not the possessions of a hobbyist. She sat back on her heels, her mind whirling. What had her uncle been doing here? This was no simple hermit's retreat. He had turned the house into a laboratory, one hidden from the eyes of the world, and had gone to great lengths to preserve it. The thought unsettled her, but it also stirred a current of awe. The swamp she had always thought of as a place of stagnation and decay had been, for him, a source of discovery, a living library. As the morning light grew stronger, she wandered once more through the house, seeing it differently now. The warped boards and crumbling plaster were not merely signs of ruin, but veils drawn over secrets. The furniture that sagged with age had once been chosen with care. The shelves of books collected with purpose. The jars of herbs placed with intention. Everything in this house had been meant to endure, to carry meaning beyond its surface. She felt a curious respect growing in her chest, mingled with unease. When she finally stepped back outside onto the leaning porch, the swamp greeted her with the shimmer of sunlight across the water, a deceptive beauty that masked its dangers. She breathed deeply of the humid air, her mind filled with questions. She had come expecting to find only a ruin, a liability she might sell for whatever she could. Instead, she had uncovered a place of hidden purpose, a legacy her uncle had concealed within rotting wood and still waters. The house was crumbling, yes, but it was alive in its own way, alive with the remnants of a man's work and the mysteries of the swamp that surrounded it. Anna felt the weight of that realization settle onto her shoulders. She was not simply standing in a derelict structure, she was standing in the grip of time itself, time that had preserved her uncle's secrets for her to find. And as the cicadas rose in chorus and the water lapped softly against the stilts, she knew she had only begun to uncover what lay hidden here. The morning came slow and pale, as though the swamp itself resented giving up the night. Anna had slept fitfully, waking often at the creak of the house or the splash of something unseen in the water outside. Her body ached from the hard floor, and her mind still swam with half-formed dreams of her uncle hunched over his notebooks, whispering instructions she could not quite hear. She pushed herself upright, brushed dust from her clothes, and returned to the table where she had laid out the discoveries from the night before. The journals, the preserved plants, the gleaming instruments, they seemed even more extraordinary in daylight. The house was still sagging and broken, but now she saw it as more than ruin. It was a vessel, hiding something her uncle had believed too important to expose. She chose the thickest notebook and opened it again. The handwriting was unmistakably his, precise and careful, each line filled with notations that bordered on the obsessive. Sketches of roots and leaves filled the margins, drawn with a naturalist's eye for detail. But what unsettled her were the words that accompanied them. Phrases such as tested on small wounds, accelerated healing observed, or compound extracted demonstrates properties beyond normal regeneration. It was not idle curiosity that had driven him. It was research with the discipline of a scientist. And woven throughout the pages were remarks that suggested secrecy. Do not trust outside interests. Some knowledge must be protected, not sold. The notes were not only about plants, they were warnings. The more she read, the more her mind returned to the memory of the men she had spoken to in town. Their amused dismissal of the house now seemed less casual and more calculated. Had they truly thought it worthless, or had they wanted her to believe so? Her uncle had clearly gone to great lengths to hide his work. The sealed crates, the reinforced compartments, the careful handwriting that danced between science and code, it all suggested he had been guarding something valuable. And now by inheritance, it was hers to guard or to squander. She closed the notebook and stood. The walls seemed closer than before, heavy with silence. She stepped outside to breathe and found the swamp staring back at her, still and endless, the water catching the morning sun in broken shards. It was beautiful and oppressive at once, a world that could swallow secrets whole and never reveal them again. But it had revealed this to her, and she could not ignore the pull. She had to know what else was hidden, what her uncle had been so determined to preserve. Her exploration of the house grew more deliberate that day. She moved from room to room with her eyes trained on the details she had overlooked before. Behind the fireplace she found stones that bore faint scratches, as if someone had shifted them regularly. In a small cabinet she discovered envelopes of pressed flowers, their petals still vivid, each labeled with dates stretching back decades. Some of the labels carried symbols she now recognized from the journal's notations for specimens with unusual properties. Every new detail added weight to the sense that this house had never been a hermit's refuge. It had been a laboratory in disguise. By late afternoon, she ventured outside to the edges of the property, her boots sinking into soft mud. She needed air, needed to feel that the world extended beyond the crumbling walls. The swamp buzzed with life dragonflies darting like sparks above the water. the distant splash of a fish breaking the surface, the sudden rush of wings as a heron rose into the sky. But when she reached the shoreline where the track disappeared into the trees, she stopped. There, imprinted in the mud, were fresh tracks, not her own, not old. Boot prints, large and heavy, pressed deep into the wet ground. She crouched and touched them. The edges were sharp. Someone had been here recently. Her heart thudded as she straightened and looked around. The swamp appeared empty, but the silence felt different now, as if holding its breath. She walked quickly back toward the house, scanning the waterline for other signs. At the far corner of the porch, she noticed something she had missed before. A frayed rope tied loosely to one of the stilts, its other end trailing into the water. It was the kind of rope one might use to tie off a boat. Whoever had left the tracks had come by water and had taken care not to leave their vessel visible from the road. Inside the house, she shut the door firmly, though she knew it would not keep out anyone determined to enter. She sat at the table again, her mind racing. If her uncle had hidden his research to keep it from corporations or opportunists, then surely they would still be interested. And if someone knew the house had passed to her, it would not take long before they came asking questions. The thought filled her with dread, but also with something else, an understanding that she was no longer a bystander in this story. She had stepped into his world, and with it came responsibility. That night, the swamp seemed louder than ever. Every splash outside set her nerves on edge. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, until exhaustion finally pulled her under. Her dreams were fevered, filled with flashes of her uncle hunched over his desk, muttering about the danger of outsiders. She dreamed of the plants themselves, their blossoms glowing faintly in the moonlight, whispering promises of healing and destruction in equal measure. When she woke, sweat chilled her skin, and the first gray light was already creeping into the room. The following day brought her into contact with the outside world again. She drove into town for supplies, candles, bottled water, some basic food to last her through the week. At the small grocery, the woman at the counter gave her a long, appraising look. "You're staying out there at the Lawson place?" she asked. Anna nodded carefully. The woman pursed her lips and leaned closer. "You'd do better to sell. Folks say that land isn't safe. Too much history. Too much trouble." Her tone carried both warning and curiosity, as though she wanted to see what Anna would choose. Later, an old fisherman sitting outside the store caught her as she walked to her car. His face was weathered like driftwood, his eyes sharp beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "That house," he said, "it don't want you there. Been standing too long, keeping things that shouldn't be kept." She asked him what he meant, but he only spat into the dust and shook his head. "Bolts break, wood rots, but secrets poison a place. Best not to dig too deep." His words clung to her even as she drove away, the image of his stern face reflected in her rearview mirror. Back at the house, she unpacked her supplies and tried to ignore the unease that had followed her from town. Yet the memory of the boot prints at the shore pressed against her thoughts. Someone else knew. Perhaps many people knew. And if her uncle had fought to keep them away, then she would have to decide whether to do the same. As the day faded, she returned to the journals. One entry caught her attention, its handwriting shakier than the others, as though written in haste. "They have found me," it read. "Offered money, promises of partnership. I refused. Must hide the most important samples deeper. If I am gone, whoever finds this must understand. The swamp holds answers that the world is not ready for. Protect them. Trust only those who honor the land." The words chilled her. They were not idle ramblings, but a plea, directed to her now across the gulf of years. She set the journal down, her hands trembling. Outside, the swamp hummed with its eternal chorus, but she no longer heard it as background noise. It was a warning, a reminder that she was not alone in this. Her uncle's legacy was more than jars of plants and sketches in notebooks. It was a burden, one that others coveted. And as she sat in the flickering light of a single candle, the shadows pressing close, she felt the weight of the past settle onto her shoulders. The house had given her its secrets, and now it demanded something in return. By the time the candle guttered out, she had made a silent promise to herself. She would not abandon the house no matter how many urged her to. She would not sell it for pennies, nor allow it to fall into the hands of those who saw only profit. Whatever her uncle had hidden, whatever dangers came with it, she would see it through. The swamp had chosen her, just as it had chosen him, and she would not turn away. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was not quite peace but something close enough for Anna to endure. She woke with the cries of birds echoing through the mist, spent the morning combing through her uncle's journals, and in the afternoons walked the swamp paths that surrounded the house, listening to the strange stillness that seemed to hover over the land. Though she told herself she was searching for more evidence of her uncle's hidden work, she knew she was also watching for signs of others. The boot prints had not faded from her mind. Even as the mud dried and washed away beneath the rains, the image of those sharp impressions haunted her. Someone had been here, someone who did not belong, and the silence of the swamp offered no promise they would not return. Her unease deepened one evening when she returned from a long walk and noticed something amiss near the porch. It was subtle at first, only a faint shift in the way the rope trailed against the water, as though it had been disturbed recently. Then she saw it, a set of muddy prints leading up onto the boards. She froze, every muscle in her body tightening. She had left that morning after carefully wiping the porch clean, a habit she had adopted out of caution. These tracks were fresh. Someone had come while she was gone. She rushed inside, her eyes scanning the dim interior for signs of intrusion. At first, everything appeared as she had left it. The notebook spread across the table, the crates closed, the jars untouched. But then she saw that one of the drawers in the cabinet stood slightly ajar. She knew with certainty she had closed it the night before. With trembling hands, she pulled it open and found the contents disturbed. The neat rows of envelopes shuffled, some turned upside down. Whoever had entered had been searching, not merely passing through. The knowledge that strangers had crossed her threshold, had touched the things her uncle had guarded so fiercely, filled her with a mix of anger and fear. She spent that night sleepless, sitting by the door with a heavy wrench clutched in her hand, listening to every creak of the house and every ripple of water outside. Her imagination painted shapes in the shadows, faces staring in through the windows, footsteps circling the stilts below. Yet no one came, and when dawn broke, she was left only with exhaustion and a lingering certainty that her solitude was broken. In the days that followed, the presence of unseen watchers became undeniable. She would hear the dip of a paddle far off across the water, though she could see no boat. Once, while gathering branches near the tree line, she caught sight of a figure vanishing into the undergrowth, moving quickly and deliberately out of view. She called out, but the swamp swallowed her voice. Another time, late at night, she saw a faint glimmer of light through the trees, the unmistakable glow of a lantern or flashlight. When she stepped outside to confront it, the light extinguished instantly, leaving her staring into blackness. The locals, too, seemed to know more than they would say. When she returned to town for more supplies, conversations grew strained at the mention of her uncle's property. One man, leaning too close at the counter, told her with a sly grin that there were always people interested in what the swamp hid. "You can't own secrets," he said, his breath sour with tobacco. "They got a way of leaking out, one way or another." His tone suggested warning and promise at once, as if he wanted her to know she had something others desired, and that he, or those he knew, might be among them. Anna felt the circle tightening. The house, once only a ruin, now felt like a fortress under siege, though the enemy remained invisible. Her uncle's warnings in the journals burned in her mind. Do not trust outside interests. Protect them. She began to understand that she had inherited not only his discoveries, but his enemies as well. Whoever had tried to buy or steal his work had not given up, and now that the property belonged to her, they had turned their attention to her as the barrier standing in their way. The pressure weighed heavily on her, eroding the fragile sense of control she had tried to build. At night, she dreamed of men in suits tearing open the crates, spilling the carefully preserved plants onto the floor while she screamed unheard. She dreamed of fire consuming the house, the swamp boiling and black. She would wake gasping, her body drenched in sweat, and lie awake until dawn, listening to the rustle of leaves and the hum of insects. Sleep offered no refuge, only deeper reminders of the threat closing in. One particularly humid evening, as the cicadas screamed in the treetops, she thought she heard voices carrying faintly across the water. She crept to the edge of the porch, straining to listen. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, men speaking in low, urgent murmurs, punctuated by the occasional splash of a paddle. She crouched in the shadows, every nerve alive with fear, until at last the sounds faded into the distance. Only then did she breathe again, her lungs aching from the effort of silence. The realization struck her with sharp clarity. They were not merely curious trespassers. They were organized, deliberate, waiting for the right moment to act. Despite her fear, a grim determination began to take root within her. She could not allow them to steal what her uncle had protected for so long. The swamp was not merely a backdrop to her life now. It was an ally, a shield, and perhaps even a weapon. She began to think in terms of defense, considering how the twisting waterways and dense thickets might conceal her movements, how the raised stilts of the house might give her an advantage. She searched the rooms for anything that might serve as a deterrent, finding rusted tools, broken boards, and heavy glass jars that could be hurled if needed. She told herself she would be ready when the intruders returned, though she knew in her heart that readiness against such unknown forces was an illusion. Her sense of isolation deepened further when she realized she had no one she could call for help. The sheriff's office in town had long been rumored to take bribes from those with enough money, and she suspected any plea for assistance would only alert the very people she feared. The neighbors who had warned her away from the property would likely see her troubles as proof of their words. Even her few acquaintances in the city were too distant, too removed from this strange corner of the world to understand or intervene. She was alone, just as her uncle had been. The pressure built toward a breaking point one night when she was jolted awake by a sudden crash outside. Heart pounding, she snatched up her flashlight and crept to the window. There, at the edge of the clearing, she saw movement shadows slipping between the trees. She swung the light toward them, but they vanished too quickly, leaving only the swaying branches behind. Yet when she lowered the beam, she caught sight of something on the porch steps. She opened the door cautiously and found it waiting for her. A dead fish, gutted and left bleeding, its innards spilling across the boards. A message, crude but unmistakable. Anna stared at it until her stomach turned. This was no longer a question of strangers passing by or idle threats whispered in town. This was deliberate, personal intimidation. They wanted her to know they were watching, that they could come as close as they wished, that the house offered no protection. She cleaned the mess with shaking hands, bile rising in her throat, and burned the remains in a shallow pit near the waterline. The stench clung to her long after, a foul reminder of her vulnerability. In the days that followed, she felt the weight of decision pressing against her. She could leave, abandon the house and the secrets it contained, and perhaps find peace elsewhere. Yet every time she considered it, she thought of her uncle's final words in the journals, the plea for protection, the belief that the swamp held answers too dangerous to release. To leave now would be to betray him, to hand over everything he had fought to preserve. And so she stayed, though her hands trembled and her heart raced, telling herself with each passing day that she had no choice but to endure. The swamp seemed to acknowledge her resolve in its own way. The chorus of frogs and insects grew louder at night, a wall of sound that cloaked her fear. The mist that rolled across the water at dawn felt like a veil, concealing her from unfriendly eyes. She began to see the land not only as a place of danger, but as a living force, one that had sheltered her uncle's secrets for decades and might yet shelter her own. It was not comfort exactly, but it was enough to carry her forward, enough to convince her that the fight was not yet lost. Still, she could not shake the certainty that the confrontation was coming. The intruders had tested her, had marked their presence, had shown her the cruelty of their intent. The next time they came, it would not be to leave warnings on her steps. It would be to take what they wanted, by force if necessary. And when that moment arrived, she knew she would have to decide whether she was strong enough to protect the house and the secrets it contained, or whether the swamp would claim her as it had claimed so many before. Anna's resolve hardened in the days after the dead fish appeared on her steps. She could still feel the memory of its cold, slick skin beneath her fingers, the reek of it clinging to her clothes long after the flames had consumed it. That message had been meant to unnerve her, to drive her from the swamp and leave her uncle's secrets undefended. Instead, it had burned away the last hesitation in her. She would not abandon the house, nor would she abandon the work her uncle had hidden so carefully. If the strangers who lurked in the shadows wanted what lay inside these walls, they would have to tear it from her hands. The nights stretched long and sleepless, each one filled with the restless noises of the swamp. She often sat in the main room, with the lantern burning low, her uncle's journal spread open on the table. The looping script became a strange comfort to her, as though his voice lingered between the lines, whispering encouragement across the years. The swamp preserves, one passage read, but it also punishes. It hides those who understand its language, and it swallows those who come with greed. She clung to these words, repeating them silently when her courage faltered. It was during one such night that she discovered the final hidden cache. She had been running her fingers absent-mindedly along the warped boards of the floor when she felt a slight unevenness, a hollow sound that differed from the rest. With her heart pounding, she pried at the seam until the wood lifted free. Beneath lay a narrow cavity, and within it, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, sealed tight against the damp. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it, revealing a stack of papers so fragile she feared they might crumble to dust. The pages were filled with meticulous drawings and notes, more detailed than anything she had seen so far. There were sketches of plants that seemed to glow faintly even in the dim lamplight, roots twisted into symbols, flowers whose petals curved like blades. Some were annotated with warnings. Do not inhale fumes, unstable when dried, while others were marked with words that suggested possibilities she could barely comprehend. Healing beyond known medicine, energy drawn from the very water and air, even glimpses of something more, an attempt to touch forces beyond the physical, experiments that walk the line between science and myth. As she turned the final pages, her uncle's voice seemed to rise more clearly than ever before. The last entry was written in a hurried hand, the ink blotched as though his pen had struggled to keep pace with his urgency. They know, it read. They are coming, but the swamp will not give them what they seek. It will only yield to one who is bound to it, who carries its silence in her blood. If she finds this, let her know. The house is not a ruin. It is a covenant. She is the last guardian. Anna sat back, the weight of the words pressing down on her chest. She had never thought of herself as a guardian of anything. Her life had been marked by loss and disappointment, not duty or strength. Yet as she read those lines again and again, she felt something shifting inside her. Perhaps her uncle had known she would come, that she would inherit not only his crumbling house, but the mantle he had carried alone for so long. The thought terrified her, but it also rooted her more firmly to the place than ever before. The following night, the confrontation she had been dreading finally came. She had dozed fitfully in the chair near the window when the first sound reached her ears, the dip of paddles, steady and deliberate. Her eyes snapped open, her body tense. She doused the lantern and moved to the shadows, peering out through a crack in the shutters. Across the water, faint lights bobbed, moving closer. There were at least 3 boats, perhaps more, and in them figures hunched low, carrying lanterns that cast eerie reflections across the black water. Her pulse hammered as she watched them glide nearer, their voices low, their movements coordinated. She could make out the glint of metal tools, perhaps weapons in their hands. They reached the edge of the clearing and tethered the boats, then began to advance toward the house. Anna's fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to breathe, to remember her uncle's words. The swamp would not yield to greed. She moved quickly through the rooms, gathering what she could, the heavy glass jars, the rusted tools, even the strange plants she had been studying. She spread them near the door and windows, her makeshift defenses clumsy but born of desperation. The intruders reached the porch, their boots thudding heavily against the boards. One of them pushed at the door, and the old wood groaned but held. Another struck it with the butt of his tool, and the hinges rattled. Anna's grip tightened around the iron wrench in her hand. She whispered a prayer she hadn't realized she still remembered, then stepped back into the shadows. ready. The door burst open with a splintering crack, and the men surged inside, their lanterns throwing wild beams across the walls. They were rough-looking, their faces shadowed by caps and masks, eyes gleaming with hunger for what they believed was hidden here. One of them kicked over a crate, another began rifling through papers. Anna waited until they moved deeper into the room, then hurled one of the jars to the floor. It shattered with a sharp report, releasing a cloud of pungent smoke that rose like a living thing. The men cursed and coughed, stumbling back. She seized the moment to strike, swinging the wrench with all her strength at the nearest intruder. The blow landed with a sickening crack, and he fell, writhing and groaning. The others turned on her, their fury blazing, but before they could rush forward, the swamp itself seemed to stir. The smoke thickened, swirling unnaturally, and the floorboards beneath their boots trembled. From the open door, a gust of damp air swept in, carrying with it the croak of frogs and the hiss of unseen creatures. The intruders faltered, their bravado crumbling as the house seemed to exhale around them. Anna felt something surge through her, then a strange calm mingled with power, as though the land itself had wrapped around her shoulders. She shouted, her voice ringing louder than she thought possible. "You don't belong here. The swamp will not have you." Her words echoed, carried by the mist, and for a moment even she believed she spoke with more than her own strength. The men broke, whether from fear of her or of the strange force that seemed to rise from the swamp. They stumbled back through the doorway, dragging their injured companion. Their lanterns swung wildly, casting fleeing shadows across the clearing as they scrambled to their boats. Within moments they were gone, the sound of their paddles fading into the distance. Anna stood shaking in the silence that followed, her chest heaving, the wrench still clutched in her hand. Slowly she lowered it, her gaze sweeping the wrecked room. Broken glass glinted on the floor, smoke hung in the air, and the journals lay scattered, but the house still stood. She still stood. In the days after, no more intruders came. Whether they had been frightened away or were regrouping for another attempt, she did not know. But something inside her had changed. She no longer felt like a trespasser in her uncle's home. She no longer doubted her place in the covenant he had described. She had faced the threat and endured, and the swamp had answered her call. The transformation was not sudden, but steady and sure. She began to rebuild the house in small ways, repairing what she could, shoring up the weak boards, cleaning the spaces that had long been left to rot. Each act felt less like maintenance and more like a pact renewed, a promise to the land and to herself. She felt the weight of her old life debts, failures, disappointments slip away with each day. Here she was not the woman abandoned and ridiculed. Here she was the guardian of something greater, something mysterious and powerful that demanded her vigilance. At night, when the mist rolled across the water and the voices of the swamp rose in chorus, she no longer lay awake in fear. She listened instead with a strange reverence, hearing in the sounds the language her uncle had once described. The swamp preserved, but it also punished. It hid those who understood, and it swallowed those who did not. Anna Lawson, once adrift and broken, now understood. She was no longer a woman running from failure. She was part of the covenant, the keeper of the house on the water, bound to the silence and the secrets of the swamp. And though she knew the world beyond might one day come again to take what it could, she also knew she would stand against it. Not alone, but with the weight of the land itself at her side. The house, once a ruin, was alive again, and so was she. Don't miss what comes next. Hit subscribe now, so you're the first to uncover more shocking stories. Watch the next video right here for another twist you won't believe. And if this one gave you chills, share it with a friend and see their reaction.